morning, everybody. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Sean.
And today we're going to go over identity management and trying to learn more on who's who in your data. So what we'll be going over today is what is distinct ID, how to track your individual users, when you should use alias versus identify, and we're going to tie it all in and show you how all of these methods tie in with making a user profile. We will be stopping in the middle and at the end of this presentation to capture any of your questions. So go ahead and please, in the bottom, there's a question box in your widget. Go ahead and put any questions you may have in there, and we'll definitely answer it either off screen or live to everybody. So let's jump right into it. So what is a distinct ID? Our distinct ID is a randomly generated identifier assigned to users who visit your platform. So they are 40 characters in length and they persist across a user's lifetime on your app unless they change their devices, browser, or clears their cookie. So distinct ID is based on a user's cookie. All of Mixpanel's reports use distinct ID. That's how we calculate totals and unique counts in our reports, and this is how we separate users from each other. We will definitely, we will give this deck to you guys after this this webinar as well. There's some useful links in this deck for you guys to check out for more further details. So we have a document that goes over how distinct ID is created and assigned with our client-side library, so JavaScript and mobile. So I talked about how it's used in reports. It's based on everything in our Mixpanel reporting. Let me open this right here. Perfect. So we are going to, the first part of our identity management is the identify function, and how it looks in Mixpanel. It's called mixpanel.identify. So how it works is that it doesn't actually create a profile. To do that, you'll need to use a different call, and we'll go over that later. Mixpanel identify lets you identify a user to a known value, but when you call identify by itself without the alias function, which we'll go over after this, it actually rewrites the value of the cookie, rewrites the distinct ID in the user's cookie. So right here, this is an example of how it works. So if you land on a website that has Mixpanel on it, means Mixpanel's tracking data on it, you get assigned a distinct ID. However, if you call Mixpanel identify and identify based on a value, you can see that if you get distinct ID again, it'll rewrite the value to whatever you identified with. And we can see this in live view here, where we landed on the website, and you can see that this distinct ID is there in live view. However, we called identify, and then the distinct ID gets overwritten. So that's how identify works with if you were calling it by itself.
Mm-hmm. So the big difference here is that while these two events, and in these screenshots, don't mind the fact that the first example says Sean at Mixpanel.com and the second one says webinar at Mixpanel.com. This was just a testing example that I was using, but the big takeaway here is you've created a separation between the first event and the second event. I fired these events on the same computer, right back to back with each other. The only difference was that Mixpanel.identify was called. So right now I have a test event and a test 2 event, and while they were done by the same person at almost the exact same time, in Mixpanel's eyes, these are 2 unique users doing a different event. So they're completely unassociated with each other. And one of the big downsides that comes with doing this is if you were to use a funnel, for example, to say how many people will go from event 1 to event 2, if you're only using identify and this identify happens somewhere in between these funnel steps, you've now created a separation, because Mixpanel can't associate an event with a different distinct ID to another distinct ID. So you'll see a lot of people showing up in step 1, for example, But then if you have an identify in between step 1 and 2, then you'll have nobody appearing in step 2. So while using identify might be simple, it's really important to identify your use case and whether identify is the right fit for you or not, because sometimes it's just not realistic. So like an example I can think of is planning a sign-up flow. So if you want to see how many people land on your website and trigger page view, for example, and then move on to register and make a purchase, you definitely don't want to be using identify, because you'll see a ton of people hitting page view, but once they register and if they've hit identify, they'll show up as completely different users and they won't be tracked in your funnel. So the next function we're going to be talking about is actually one that works hand in hand with identify. It's called Mixpanel.alias. So Mixpanel.alias is the answer to the previous question, which was, how can I make sure that a user's events are always tied with them, even after I identify them and associate them with a value? And the answer is alias. So what alias does is it creates a table in Mixpanel with values. It'll have aliases and it'll have distinct IDs. So if you were to, for example, try to picture it in your head, just think of like one table where it says these values belong to these distinct IDs. Now, using that information, you'll see that if I was to do Mixpanel.alias with Sean at Mixpanel.com, you'll see something fired, create alias. And what's happened now is if I do Mixpanel.get distinct ID, my distinct ID hasn't changed. So this is the big takeaway. All of this is associated with one person. And I'm just going to jump to the next slide really quick. So what I did here is after creating this alias, I opened a new computer. I then fired Mixpanel.identify, Sean at Mixpanel.com. What happened is Mixpanel went into the backend, it checked, it saw that there was an alias, and it figured out that I was actually not distinct ID Sean at Mixpanel.com, but my actual originally assigned distinct ID. So looking down here, we have the event in Mixpanel, and you'll see that while my browser says my distinct ID is Sean at Mixpanel.com, Mixpanel actually, once it arrives at Mixpanel, it's changed to the original distinct ID. The best practice here is that you alias only once in a user's lifetime, because you don't want a user to have more than one alias. So with that in mind, we always recommend aliasing during registration. This is an event that we anticipate users will only do once in their lifetime, and then identify on login. So just going through this flow that I tried to simulate up here with these images, I visited a website, let's say Music Finder, for example, and I'm assigned a random distinct ID, the value ABC perhaps. I can go ahead and trigger a few events, and these will all show up under this distinct ID that I was assigned, ABC. Then I decide I'm going to go ahead and register. So once I register, I'll encounter a Mixpanel.alias command for Sean at Mixpanel.com. This is telling Mixpanel that anything done by Sean at Mixpanel.com should actually be ABC. So I'll continue to do events and I'll be viewed as ABC in that session. Now, say I open up Music Finder on another computer and start browsing. I'll be given another random distinct ID in this case. So let's say XYZ. Any events I do will be associated under XYZ and will show up as a completely different event. But then I've decided I'm going to go ahead and log in. So then when I log in, I'll run into the identify command. So it'll say Mixpanel.identify, Sean at Mixpanel.com, and all the events going forward, they'll arrive to Mixpanel with the distinct ID Sean at Mixpanel.com. But once they arrive, Mixpanel will realize, okay, any events associated with this person actually belong to ABC. So let's change this distinct ID to ABC. Now, what I wanted to show you was a quick slide. This is from our Help Center. This covers all the concepts I spoke about, but I think it's a really great image because it encapsulates like all the information in like a small picture. But it basically goes through the same flow. So you have activity coming in under a random distinct ID. It's anonymous browsing. The alias is sent to Mixpanel. So Sally at gmail.com is distinct ID 12345. the lookup table gets created. So that's the alias table that I mentioned that's stored in Mixpanel. Then every time Sally logs in and you call mixpanel.identify on sally@gmail.com, she gets identified as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a couple edge cases that I want to go over, and one of them is when to call just identify. So right now we're going with the assumption that you've decided to implement using our best practice, which is alias at register and identify at login. So one thing that will come up is what to do about users who already have accounts. So these users, maybe you implemented Mixpanel after your website was created or your app was created, and you already have a couple of users that are taking advantage of your app, and you don't know how to give them aliases. In this case, the best practice that we can recommend is to actually not alias them at all. It's too tricky to go ahead and find one-off users that already have accounts and apply aliases just to those users. So the best way to do this moving forward is actually to just not change your implementation, have there be an identify command when log in, just as normal. And for these specific users, we'll just identify them only. You won't have pre-browsing data on these users, but since they've made an account, they already have gone through the flow that you would care about for like a new user. So you don't really, those events aren't as important. So it's fine to just identify these users and just have their distinct IDs change moving forward. And that won't have any impact on tracking one user versus another. The other call out that I want to make was what happens when I call alias alone. So if you only call alias, there's actually very little that's happening, because once you've called alias, you've created this lookup, but if this user is never going to be identified, they'll never be tied to the alias that you just created. So all you would be doing would be creating aliases over and over again, and it would just end up in this slippery slope where every email address is tied to different values, but there's no one actually identifying themselves as those values. This also goes into why we recommend aliasing during registration and only once in a user's lifetime, because you want to prevent chain aliasing. Chain aliasing is what we describe when one alias points to another alias, which points to another alias, and then to a distinct ID. So if you were to alias multiple times for one user, it's totally possible to end up in this situation, but you start to see weird behavior, because if Sean at mixpanel.com is alias to Andrea at mixpanel.com is alias to ABC, you have this confusion and this long path that has to be followed, and sometimes users will be identified by Andrea at mixpanel.com, sometimes they'll be identified as Sean at mixpanel.com, and it just creates this flow in which the events might behave inconsistently. Okay.
That was a lot of information that we just gave to you. Does anybody have any questions at the moment with any of the things that we've covered? Go ahead and type them into the question box, and we can answer them live. We'll stop for probably about 5 minutes, see if anybody has anything to ask. So just a quick overview. The reason you want to alias and identify together is that you are linking anonymous browsing, and then you identify to link them to a known value. So alias points to a known value, however, and then identify, make sure that all of these anonymous browsing will go into the user's profile consistently from that point on. And we'll go over that when we go over how user profiles are made. Does anybody, if nobody has any other questions, we can keep on going. Okay. Calling once, twice, and all right. So creating user profiles. So alias and identify don't actually make user profiles. That's a separate call. So in JavaScript, it actually looks as mixpanel.people.set. So how this works with how that works when creating a profile. So we alias on one time on sign up or registration. That means we link their distinct ID and then we alias to a known value. Usually it's an email address, and that's given during a registration period. This is why we only alias when they register. And then moving forward, when they log in, we go ahead and identify, because then we know that if they log in with the email address, we identify that email address, and then we go, Mixpanel checks back onto our alias table, see if it's already linked to or pointed to a known distinct ID. Then all the events moving forward will be pointed to that distinct ID, and then it'll be linked with that user. So alias with new users on sign up, and identify with existing users on login only. This is actually really important because distinct ID is used in all of our reports to use totals and uniques and funnels and retention and everything like that. Having a really solid identity management and calling alias and identify with your profile creation, make sure that your data is consistent. So we can see here, Sean was able to create a profile. We identified on his email, and you can see, oh, whoa, sorry. We can see here that we have his email as Cheyenne@mixpanel.com. His user properties are here. So whenever Sean logs in again using the same email address, all of his activity will be tallied in his activity feed, and all the properties that you captured during his activity will show up here on his properties on his user profile. So the scenario to keep in mind here is that you can create user profiles even without adding any people properties. You just need to call people set and identify together. So you can you don't have to capture all the properties at once. That's something that you could do along the way, depending on all the events that that your users perform. I think that is pretty much it for creating user profiles. One thing that we do want to make sure, because our reports use distinct ID, it's something that you cannot query by. However, if you want to use distinct ID in your reports and you want to query by distinct ID, you would have to be setting it as a property on the user profile. And that's something that you guys can do along the way if that's something that you'd like to do. Hopefully this information has made sense. I know it's a lot of information really fast. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in while you have us here.
Yeah, totally happy to tackle any questions about alias, identify, distinct ID, people profiles, how they all tie in to each other, and all of our reports. So we'll be standing by for a few minutes to see if there's any questions coming in.
I think one of the best use cases or best questions that we've gotten is that it depends on your platform if you want to use alias and identify. So one thing is there anonymous events before your registration that you would like to tie with a user? That's when you want to use alias and identify. However, if you're a different platform where you ask users to create a registration or create an account right from the start, then you would only identify. So it's the question of if there's something in the beginning that you don't know who they are, but you want to tie them to something, to a profile later, that's when alias and identify work best.
Yeah, I see we have one question come in. It just says, I use identify when signing up users and it seems to work just fine. That's completely true. There is nothing wrong with using identify. In certain cases, using identify is actually the best option. So it all depends on your use case. The only reason that you wouldn't want to use identify, because it is much simpler to implement, it's much simpler to manage. But the only downside is that events that are done before the identify command are not tied to the same profile after the identify command. So it's one thing to look out for. It depends on, like I said, your use case, because not everyone needs to have pre-registration or pre-identified events tied to the same user. If you do, though, I'd be happy to help you set this up. You can write in, and our support team can make sure you get your identity management all sorted out.
So there are some use cases where I want to know what my users are doing on my platform before signing up. Then in order to have that anonymous or pre-registration events tied to the same user, that's where we would alias and identify.
Okay, let's see. Perhaps this is because we have a follow-up question. Perhaps this is because I use the Python API in the backend to track events as opposed to JavaScript, where the user could be using the website for a while before signing up. That's exactly it.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, perfect. So you're all set then. When you're using the Python API and any server-side implementation, it's like a whole different beast, and there's a different set of best practices that apply to it.
Yeah, so we only, for the purpose of this webinar, we're only covering client-side implementations, which means JavaScript or any of the mobile libraries, iOS, Swift, and Android. So alias and identifying definitely only work best for those. If you're using a server-side implementation, that's a different topic. But if you have a question with that, feel free to write in. We'll definitely get those answered. We have a question. What's the best solution when you unfortunately have some distinct IDs being mixed up, say different user registered using the same browser? Can you delete one of the record and rely on the next clean login with correct alias? So my backup question is, are you having users log in with the same device, using the same browser? If that's the case, if you're expecting multiple users using the same device on a multiple browser, we suggest doing a reset call on log out so that when they log back in, it's a new distinct ID.
Yeah, so to expand on that, mixpanel.reset, it basically just resets the Mixpanel cookie. So if this is something we recommend to use in scenarios where you'll see, as Andrea said, multiple users using the same device and browser, because we want to make sure that every time someone logs out, their profile is basically purged from that device's local storage. Now, touching on your question, which is how do we get out of this situation? It depends. If you're using identify, it's a pretty simple fix. All you have to do is implement reset, and then everyone moving forward from that point should be falling into the correct profiles. On the other hand, though, if you're using alias, there's no way to delete existing aliases. So if you've fallen into a situation where you have like multiple aliases pointing to one distinct ID incorrectly, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to get out of that situation, at least at this moment. It's definitely something that we're looking at in the future on improving with changes to data governance and how you can manage your data.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect. Happy I was able to help.
We have a couple more minutes for some more questions if there are any. Again, every platform or every business is different, so your use case may be different from what we've outlined. So we're happy to help to make sure that all of your reports and your user profiles are clean and you're tracking them correctly, so all that your data is clean.
If there aren't any more questions, and it looks like there's no more coming in, then I think that's it for today. I see that there's a post to where you can request help from support posted in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to visit that link and fill out a request, and you'll get help by one of our support engineers.
And this webinar is actually going to be recorded and will be emailed to you in about the next couple of hours. The deck will also be included with the links that we've used to build this webinar. So feel free to look into those. And if you have further questions after that, we're always here to help.
Have a great day, everyone.
Hi, everybody.